So I am going to start by introducing the area in which the midwife worked and a little bit about a background and also a little bit about midwifery, as I believe it's pronounced, in England. Nonada's house was situated in the heart of the London Docklands. The area was densely populated, and most families had lived there for generations, often not moving more than a street or more away from their birthplace. Family life was lived at close quarters, and children were brought up by a widely extended family of aunts, grandparents, cousins, and older siblings, all living within a few houses or at most a few streets of each other. Children were everywhere, and the streets were their playgrounds in the 1950s. The bomb sites were the adventure playgrounds. They were numerous, a terrible reminder of the war and the intense bombing of the Docklands only 10 years before. Great chunks had been cut out of the terraces, each encompassing perhaps 2 or 3 streets. It was undoubtedly a rough area. Knifings were common, street fights were common, pub fights and brawls were an everyday event. In the small, overcrowded houses, domestic violence was expected. But I never heard of gratuitous violence against children or towards the elderly. There was a certain respect for the weak. Employment was high, but wages were low, and the hours were long. The men holding the skilled jobs had relatively high pay and regular hours, and their jobs were fiercely guarded. Their skills were usually kept in the family, passed from father to sons or nephews. But for the casual laborers, life must have been hell. Early marriage was the norm. There was a high sense of sexual morality, even prudery, amongst the respectable people of the East End. Unmarried partners were virtually unknown, and no girl would ever live with her boyfriend. If she attempted to, there would be hell to pay from her family. What went on in the bomb sites or behind the dustbin sheds was not spoken of. If a young girl did become pregnant, the pressure on the young man to marry her was so great that few resisted. Families were large, often very large, and divorce was rare. Intense and violent family rows were common, but husbands and wives usually stuck together. Few women went out to work. Once the babies started coming, it was impossible. An endless life of child rearing, cleaning, washing, shopping, and cooking would be her lot. I often wondered how these women managed with a family of up to 13 or 14 children in a small house containing only 2 or 3 bedrooms. Some families of that size lived in the tenements, which often consisted of 2 rooms and a tiny kitchen. Life has changed in the last 50 years. My memories of the Docklands bear no resemblance to what is known today. Family and social life have completely broken down, and 3 things occurring together within a decade ended centuries of tradition: the closure of the docks, slum clearance, and the pill. In the late 1950s, we had 80 to 100 deliveries a month on our books. In 1963, the number had dropped to 4 or 5 a month. Now that is some social change. I'm going to read 2 episodes that Jennifer Worth, the author of this book called The Midwife, wrote. This book is written in episodes or chapters, each with a vignette about either a person or a delivery or a family, each one of which is fascinating. I'm going to start with my favorite colorful character, Fred. Nonada's house was a convent, then nuns were the midwives, but in addition, there were several nurse midwives who were not nuns, and Jennifer Worth, the author, was one of them. A convent is essentially a female establishment. However, of necessity, The male of the species cannot be excluded entirely. Fred was the boilerman and odd jobber of Nonnatus house. He was typical of the Cockney of his day and age: stunted growth, short-bowed legs, powerful hairy arms, pugnacious, obstinate, resourceful. All these attributes were combined with endless chat and irrepressible good humor. His most striking characteristic was a spectacular squint. One eye was permanently directed northeast, whilst the other roved in a southwesterly direction. If you added to this the single yellow tooth jutting from his upper jaw, which he generally held over his lower lip and sucked, you would not say he was a beautiful specimen of manhood. However, so delightful was his optimism, good humor, and artless self-confidence that the sisters held him in great affection and leaned on him heavily for all practical matters. The only person who did not respond with delight to Fred's particular brand of Cockney charm was Mrs. B., who was a Cockney herself and had seen it all before and was not impressed. Mrs. B. was queen of the kitchen. She worked from 8 a.m. to 2 p.m. each day and produced superb food for us. She was an expert in steak and kidney pies, thick stews, savory mince, toad in the hole, treacle puddings, jam roly-poly, macaroni puddings, and so on, as well as baking the best bread and cakes you could find anywhere. She was a large lady with formidable frontage and a particular glare as she growled, "Now then, don't you mess up my kitchen." As the kitchen was the meeting point for all staff when we came in, often tired and hungry, this remark was frequently heard. We girls were very docile and respectful, especially as we had learned from experience that flattery usually resulted in a tart or a wedge of cake straight from the oven. Fred, however, was not so easily tamed. For one thing, the orientation of his eyes being what it was, he generally could not see the mess he was making. For another, Fred was not going to kowtow to anyone. He would grin at Mrs. B. wickedly, suck his tooth, slop her ample bottom, and chuckle, "Come off it, old girl." Mrs. B.'s glare would turn into a shout, "You get out of my kitchen, you ugly mug, and stay out." Unfortunately, Fred couldn't stay out, and she knew it. The coke stove was in the kitchen, and he was responsible for stoking it, raking it out, opening and shutting the flues, and generally keeping it in good order. As Mrs. B. did much of her cooking and baking and that stove, she knew that she was dependent upon him. So a strained truce prevailed among them. Only occasionally, about twice a week, a shouting match erupted. I noticed with interest that during these altercations, neither of them swore. No doubt this was out of respect for the nuns. Had they been in any other environment, I feel sure the air would have been blue with obscenities. Fred lived with his unmarried daughter Dolly in the lower 2 rooms of a small house backing onto the docks. He had been called up during the war, but due to his eyesight, had been unable to enter the armed services. He was therefore consigned to the Pioneer Corps, where, if Fred is to be believed, he spent 6 years serving king and country by cleaning out latrines. Compassionate leave was granted to him in 1942, when his wife and 3 of their children were killed by a direct hit. He was able to spend a little time with his 3 living children, who were shocked and traumatized in a hostel in North London before they were evacuated to Somerset, and he was ordered back to the latrines. After the war, he took up 2 cheap rooms and brought up the remains of his family single-handed. It was never easy for him to find a regular job because his eyesight was erratic, and because he would not commit himself to be away from home for long hours. He knew that his children needed him, so he had developed a wide range of money-making activities, some of which were legal. Whilst we, the lay staff, took our breakfast in the kitchen, Fred was generally attending to his boiler, so there was plenty of opportunity to press him for stories, which he did unashamedly. For his part, Fred would always oblige, as he clearly loved spinning his yarns, often prefaced by, "You're never going to believe this one." A laughing audience of 4 young girls was music to his ears. Young girls will laugh at anything. We had seen Fred in the market selling onions, but did not know that he grew them. Having the ground floor of a small house gave him a small garden, which was given over to onions. He had tried potatoes. No money in spuds, but onions proved to be a moneymaker. He also kept chickens and sold the eggs, and the birds as well. He wouldn't sell to a butcher. "I'm not having no one take half the profits," but sold directly to the market. He wouldn't take a stall either. "I'm not paying no bleeding rent to the council," and laid a blanket on the floor in any space available, selling his onions, eggs, and chickens from there. Fred's best line with the highest profit margin had been fireworks. His unit of the Pioneer Corps had been attached to the Royal Engineers in North Africa for a time. Explosives had been in daily use. Anyone, however humble, working with the Royal Engineers was bound to learn something about explosives, and Fred had picked up enough to give him confidence to embark on fireworks manufacturing. He would say, "It's easy. You just need a load of the right kind of fertilizer and a touch of this and mix it with a bit of that, and bingo, you got your bang." Chummy said, wide-eyed with apprehension, "But isn't it frightfully dangerous, Fred?" Nah, not if you know what you're doing, like what I does." Sold like nobody's business they did all over Poplar. Everyone was wanting him. I could have made a fortune if they'd left me alone, the bleeders, begging your pardon, miss. Who? What happened? Police got hold of some of me fireworks and tested them and says they was dangerous and I was endangering human life. I asked you, would I do anything like that? Would I? He looked up from his position on the floor and spread out his ash-covered hands in innocent appeal. Of course not, Fred. We all chorused. What happened? Well, they charged me, didn't they? But the magistrate, he lets me off with a fine, because I had 3 kids. He was a good bloke, he was, the magistrate, but he says I would go to prison if I done it again. Kids are no kids, so I never done it no more. Fred's chickens led to quails, which he supplied to West End restaurants. Quails are delicate birds, requiring warmth, so he kept them in the house. Being small, they do not need much space, so he bred and reared them in boxes, which he kept under the bed. He slaughtered and plucked them in the kitchen. His most recent economic adventure had been in toffee apples, and very successful it was too. Dolly made the toffee mixture in the little kitchen, while Fred purchased crates of cheap apples from Covent Garden. All that was needed was a stick to put the apples on, dip it in the toffee, and in no time rows of toffee apples were lining up on the draining board. Fred couldn't imagine why he hadn't thought of it before. It was a winner, 100% profit margin, and assured sales with a large number of children around. He foresaw a rosy future with unlimited sales and profits. A week or 2 later, it was clear that something had gone wrong from the silence of the small figure crouched down by the stove, manipulating the flue. No cheerful greeting, no chat, no tuneless whistle, just silence. He couldn't even respond to our questions. Eventually, Chummy left the table and went over to him. "Come on, Fred, what's up? Perhaps we can help. And even if we can't, you will feel better if you tell us." She touched his shoulder with her huge hand. Fred turned and looked up. His northeast eye drooped, and a little moisture glinted in the southwest. His voice was husky as he spoke. Feathers. Quail's feathers. That's what's up. Someone complained that feathers were stuck to me toffee apples. So food safety boffins came and examined them and said feathers and bits of feathers were stuck to all me toffee apples and I was endangering public health. Apparently, the health inspector had asked at once to see where the toffee apples were made, and when shown the kitchen in which the quails were regularly slaughtered and plucked, had immediately ordered that both occupations be discontinued on pain of prosecution. So great was the disaster to Fred's economy that it seemed nothing could be said to comfort him. Chummy was so kind and assured him that something else would turn up, something better, but he was not reassured, and it was a glum breakfast that morning. He had lost face, and it hurt. But Fred's triumph was yet to come. That is another chapter, and I will not tell you exactly the nature of the triumph, except that it involved pigs. So I'm going to go to the second of the two episodes or stories that I intended to read. This, I think, is one of my favorites, and I hope you'll enjoy it as well. Ted was 58 when his wife died. She developed cancer, and he nursed her tenderly for 18 months. He gave up his job in order to do so, and they lived on his savings during her illness. They had a happy marriage and were very close. No children had been born to them, and they had depended entirely on each other for companionship, neither of them being particularly extrovert or sociable. After her death, he was very lonely. He had few real friends, and his mates at work had largely forgotten him since his leaving. He had never cared for pubs and clubs and was not going to try to be the clubby sort at the age of nearly 60. It seems to be a law of life that a lonely widower will always find a woman to console and comfort him. If he is left with young children, he is even more favorably placed. Women are queuing up to look after both him and the children. A lonely widow will usually not find men crowding around, anxious to give her love and companionship. If she has children, the men will usually run a mile away. She will be left alone to struggle on and support herself and her children, and usually her life will be one of unremitting hard work. Winnie had lived alone for longer than she cared to remember. Her young husband had been killed early in the war, leaving her with 3 children. A meager pension from the state barely covered the rent, let alone compensated for the loss of her husband. She took a job in a paper shop. The hours were long and hard, from 5 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. She got up each morning at 4:30 to get down to the newsagents to receive, sort, pack, and put out the newspapers. Her mother came in each day at 8 a.m. to get the children up and off to school. It meant that they were alone for almost 4 hours, but it was a risk she had to take. Winnie's mom suggested they should all come and live with her, but Win valued her independence and refused unless, as she said, I just can't cope anymore. That day never came. Winnie was the coping sort. They met in the paper shop. She had served him for many years, but never noticed him particularly amongst all her other customers. It was when he started hanging around in the shop for longer than necessary to buy a morning paper that she began to take note. He would buy his paper, then look at another, then look at the magazine shelves, sometimes buying one. Then he would pick up a bar of chocolate and turn it over in his hand, sigh, put it back, and buy a packet of Woodbines instead. The staff said to each other, Something's up with that old geezer. One day, when Ted was holding a bar of chocolate, Winnie went up to him and asked kindly if she could help. He said, "No, dearie, there's nothing you can do for me. My wife used to like this chocolate. I used to get it for her. She died last year. Thank you for asking, dear." And their eyes met with sympathy and understanding. After that, Winnie always made a point of serving him. One day, Ted said, "I was thinking of going to the flicks tonight. How about coming with me, if your husband don't object?" She said, "I ain't got no husband, and I don't mind if I do." One thing led to another, and within a year, he asked her to marry him. Winnie thought about it for a week. There were over 20 years between them. She was fond of him, but not really in love with him. He was kind and good, though not wildly exciting. She consulted her mother, and the outcome of the female deliberations was that she accepted his offer of marriage. Ted was overjoyed, and they had a church wedding. He did not want to take his new bride to the house which he had shared for so long with his first wife, so he gave up the rental and took another terraced property. Winnie was able to give up the tiny cheap flat where she had brought up her children, so the terraced cottage was just for her and Ted. It seemed like a palace to her. As the weeks and months passed after the marriage, her happiness grew, and she told her mother that she had not done the wrong thing. When he was young, Ted had prudently taken out an insurance policy that matured when he was 60. He now did not have to go to work ever again. Winnie, on the other hand, did not want to give up the paper shop. She was so used to hard work that idleness would have bored her to tears. But Ted wanted her at home more, and she agreed to cut down her hours. Their life was very happy. Winnie was 44 when her period stopped. She thought it was the menopause. She felt a bit odd, but her mother told her that all women feel a bit funny during the change and not to worry. She continued in the paper shop and brushed aside any feelings of queasiness. It wasn't until 6 months later that she noticed she was putting on weight. Another month passed, and Ted noticed a hard lump in her tummy. Having experienced his first wife dying of cancer, he did not want to take any chances. He insisted that she should see the doctor and went with her to the surgery. Examination showed her to be in an advanced stage of pregnancy. The couple was shattered. Why this obvious explanation had not occurred to either of them before is impossible to conjecture, but it hadn't, and they were both knocked sideways by the news. There wasn't much time to prepare for a new baby. Winnie left the paper shop that day and booked with the sisters for her confinement. Hastily, the bedroom was prepared and baby equipment bought. Perhaps it was buying the pram and little white sheets that affected Ted so profoundly. Overnight, he changed from a bemused and bewildered elderly man to an intensely excited and fiercely proud father-to-be. Suddenly, he looked 10 years younger. A fortnight passed. Winnie went into labor. We had arranged for a doctor to be present at the delivery because there had been so little time for a prenatal preparation, and because Winnie, now 45, was decidedly old for having a baby. Ted had taken note of our requirements and advice about preparation. He couldn't have planned it more carefully or thoroughly. He had told Win's mother not to come, but that Ted would inform her when the baby was born. He had obtained books on childbirth and baby care, which he read all the time. When she went into labor, he called us, full of joy and anticipation, tinged only with a little anxiety. The doctor and I arrived at almost the same time. It was early first stage, and it had been agreed that I should stay with her throughout labor, from the time of arrival to the third stage completion. The doctor examined her and said he would leave and called back just before evening surgery to assess progress. I sat down to watch and wait. I advised that she should not lie down but walk about a bit. Ted took Wynn's arm and gently and carefully led her up and down the garden. She could quite easily have walked it by herself, but he wanted and needed to be protective, quite forgetful of the fact that only 2 weeks earlier she had been dashing off to the paper shop. I suggested she have a bath. The house boasted a bathroom, and so he heated up the water and gently helped her in. He washed her carefully, helped her out, and then dried her. I advised a light meal, so he poached an egg. He couldn't have done more. The doctor returned just before 6 o'clock, and there was no real change in the early labor pattern. We agreed that in view of her age, if the first stage continued for longer than 12 hours, Winnie should be transferred to the hospital. Both Ted and Winnie agreed to this, but hoped it would not be necessary. Between 9 and 10 o'clock, I noticed a change in the labor pattern. Contractions were more frequent and stronger. I started her on the gas and air machine and asked Ted to go out and phone for the doctor. When he arrived, the doctor gave her a mild analgesic, and we both sat down and waited. Ted courteously offered us a meal, or tea, or drinks, whatever we wanted. We did not have long to wait. Just after midnight, the second stage of labor commenced, and within 20 minutes the baby was born. It was a little boy with unmistakable mixed race features. The doctor and I looked at each other and the mother in stunned silence. No one said a word. I have never known such an unnerving silence at delivery. What each of us was thinking, the others never knew, but our thoughts must have all been about the same question. What on earth is Ted going to say when he sees the baby? The third stage had to be dealt with, and this was conducted in dead silence. While the doctor was busy with the mother, I bathed, checked, and weighed the baby. He certainly was a beautiful little thing of average weight, clear dusky skin, soft curly brown hair, a picture-perfect baby, if you were expecting to see a baby of mixed racial origins. But Ted wasn't. He was expecting to see his own child. I shut my eyes in a futile attempt to obliterate the scene to come. Everything was finished and tidied up. The mother looked fresh in a white nightgown. The baby looked beautiful in a white shawl. The doctor said, "I think we had better ask your husband to come up now." They were the first words to be spoken since the delivery. Winnie said, "I reckon as how we'd better get it over with." I went downstairs and told Ted that a baby boy had been safely born and would he like to come up. He shouted, "A boy!" and leaped to his feet like a youngster of 22, not a man of over 60. He bounded up the stairs 2 at a time, entered the bedroom, and took both his wife and the baby in his arms. He kissed them both and said, "This is the proudest and happiest day of my life." The doctor and I exchanged glances. He hadn't noticed yet. He said to his wife, "You don't know what this means to me, Wynn. Can I hold a baby?" She silently handed him over. Ted sat at the edge of the bed and cradled the baby awkwardly in his arms. He looked long at his little face and stroked his hair and ears. He undid the shawl and looked at the tiny body. He touched his legs and moved his arms and took his hand. The baby's face puckered up and gave a little mewing cry. Ted gazed at him silently for a long time. Then he looked up with a beatific smile. "Well, I don't reckon to know much about babies, but I can see how this is the most beautiful in the world. What's we going to call him, love?" The doctor and I looked at each other in silent amazement. Was it really possible that he hadn't noticed? Winnie, who had seemed unable to breathe, took a long, shuddering breath and said, "You choose, Ted, love. He's your'n." "We'll call him Edward, then. It's a good old family name. Me dad and granddad's. He's my son, Ted." The doctor and I left the three of them sitting happily together. Outside, the doctor said, "It is possible that he just hasn't noticed yet. Black skin is pale at birth, and this child is obviously only half black, or maybe even less than that, because his father may have been of mixed racial descent. However, pigmentation usually becomes more marked as the child ages, and at some stage, Ted is certainly going to notice and start asking questions. Time went by, and Ted didn't notice, or in any event, didn't appear to notice. Wynne must have had a word with her mother and other female relatives to say nothing to Ted about the baby's appearance, and indeed, nothing was said. Wynne went back to work part-time at the paper shop after about 6 weeks. Ted had longer each day with the baby and assumed most of the parenting. He bathed and fed him and proudly took him out in the pram, greeting passers-by and inviting them to look at my son Ted. As the baby grew older, he played with him all the time, inventing learning games and toys. In consequence, at the age of 18 months, little Ted was very bright and advanced for his age. The relationship between father and son was lovely to see. By the time the child reached school age, his features were noticeably black. Yet still Ted didn't seem to notice. He had made a wider circle of friends than he had ever had in his life before, largely due to the fact that he took the child everywhere, and people responded to this bright, handsome little boy whom Ted introduced proudly as my son Ted. The child was just as proud in his own way of his father, and he clung to his big protective hand, gazed up adoringly with his huge black eyes. At school, he always spoke of my dad as though he were the king himself. Ted, approaching 70, had no inhibitions about waiting outside the school gates, along with young mothers nearly half a century his junior. Only 2 or 3 little black or mixed-race children would come running out of school to black mothers, but one of them would fling himself into Ted's arms with the cry, "Daddy!" "Let's go down to the docks today, son," he would say, kissing him. "There's a big German vessel just coming in this morning with 3 funnels. You don't see him very often, and your mom will have tea ready when we gets back." Yet still he didn't seem to notice. Of course, there were whisperings and gossip amongst neighbors and acquaintances, but none of them actually said anything to Ted. The more unkind would snigger and say, "There's no fool like an old fool," and the rest would laugh and agree, "You can say that again." I have a different theory. In the Russian Orthodox Church, there is the concept of the holy fool. It means someone who is a fool to the ways of the world, but wise to the ways of God. I think that Ted, from the moment he saw the baby, knew that he could not possibly be the father. It must have been a shock, but he had controlled himself and sat thinking as he held the baby. Perhaps he saw ahead. Perhaps he understood in that moment that if he so much as questioned the baby's fatherhood, it would mean humiliation for the child and might jeopardize his entire future. Perhaps, as he held the baby, he realized that any such suggestion could shatter his whole happiness. Perhaps he understood that he could not reasonably expect an independent and energetic spirit like Winnie to find him sexually exciting and fulfilling. Perhaps an angel's voice told him that any questions were best left unasked and unanswered. And so he decided upon the most unexpected and yet the simplest course of all. He chose to be such a fool that he couldn't see the obvious. So I think that is all that I have to read for today. I love this book, and it has a host of other wonderful stories, some of them heartbreaking. It's called The Midwife. It's actually in 3 volumes. This is the first volume by Jennifer Worth. Thank you all very much.